The wind howled, not a gentle breeze brushing through spring grass. This was a winter wind carrying the invisible blade of Kentucky frost. It slashed through the dry pines at the edge of Ashpine Town, leaving behind a long, chilling, and eerie whistle. The sky was a sickly gray curtain, heavy, threatening to drop more snow onto a ground already frozen solid. The temperature outside hovered at 15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze tree sap, crack the paint on old pickup trucks, and turn the earth into a giant concrete slab. In the middle of that desolate expanse, Cinder was digging. He was a sheepdog mix, his ash-gray coat mottled with dull white streaks stained by mud. Usually, a dog clawing at the dirt in the dead of winter has two reasons: burying a bone or catching the scent of an unlucky field mouse's burrow. But Cinder wasn't acting like a hunter. He didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. Low, guttural growls rumbled in his throat, as if he were threatening an invisible enemy beneath the snow. His two front paws clawed frantically at a single spot, his nails scraping against the hardened, packed earth to create a harsh, ear-piercing sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. 10 yards away, Gus Calloway stood perfectly still, 71 years old. His back stooped slightly, but his shoulders were broad and square, as if carved from sedimentary rock. He wore a canvas jacket, frayed at the elbows, and a faded baseball cap that shadowed half his eyes. Those eyes showed no surprise. They were flat, lifeless, like the abandoned mine shafts his father had crawled into 6 decades ago. Gus brought a cigarette to his lips, taking a long drag. The cherry glowed red, pushing back the frost near his nose. He didn't call Cinder off. He knew his dog. Animals possess a primal instinct that humans, with all their arrogance of degrees and machinery, lost a long time ago. They can feel the heartbeat of the earth. Gus flicked the ash onto the snow, lifting his heavy cowhide boots to step forward. The rubber soles crushed the crusted snow with a sharp, splintering crunch. He walked slowly, step by step, measuring the earth's feedback beneath his feet. Seeing his master approach, Cinder stopped digging, took 2 steps back, and tucked his tail between his legs. He snorted, staring intently at the shallow hole he had just carved out. Gus stopped. He dropped to one knee in the snow. Ice flakes clung to the corduroy fabric at his joint. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled off his right sheepskin glove, stuffing it into his breast pocket. His bare hand was exposed to the biting wind. It was a hand that did not belong to the modern world. It was a map of pale scars, yellowed nails, and deep creases filled with the eternal black dust of coal, a dust that could never be washed away. Gus placed that rough palm onto the bare, brown-black soil lightly dusted with snow at the bottom of the hole. He closed his eyes. No movement, no sound, only the wind screaming around him. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds passed. Gus's fingers gently dug into the clay. It wasn't hard as a rock. It was loose, slightly damp, and most importantly, it pulsed an energy into his palm. The ground was warm. In the middle of a Kentucky winter, barely 3 inches below the frozen surface, the clay radiated a faint, smoldering heat, a complete defiance of natural law. Gus opened his eyes. He didn't utter a word of shock. He didn't furrow his brow in horror. His hand retreated, fingers slowly rubbing together to feel the grit of the soil. There is an unspoken rule among men who cling to the Appalachian ridges. If the ground is warm in winter, the earth is bleeding underneath. Gus stood up straight. His gaze shifted toward the horizon, piercing across the vast field. Beneath this snow-covered plain lay no peaceful meadow. It was a massive stomach filled with dark, hollow, spider-webbed tunnels dug in 1961. And somewhere in that suffocating darkness, dozens of feet below, a static spark or a ruthless chemical reaction had ignited a coal seam. The coal was burning itself. A fire that didn't need abundant oxygen, didn't need light. It only needed to consume itself, radiating a stifling heat up to the surface. "Let's go home, Cinder," Gus grumbled in his throat, his voice as coarse as grinding gravel. The dog gave a low bark, turned, and trotted after the old man, leaving behind a small, loose hole in a sea of white snow, quietly exhaling a thin, translucent wisp of steam, invisible to the naked eye. Welcome to our channel. If you are drawn to suffocating psychological stories, where the truth is often buried under the perfect veneer of power, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The war between blood-stained experience and the arrogance of college degrees is just beginning. Do not miss any episode in this series. Gus's old Ford truck rattled to a halt in front of a corrugated tin shed. The rust-red roof, stained with dried rain streaks, looked like a massive wound against the white snow. The heavy wooden door creaked open with a mournful groan. Inside, the shed was pitch black. The smell of dampness, sawdust, and thick, heavy machine oil hit the nose instantly. It was the scent of sweat, of manual labor, of an era left behind. Gus didn't turn on the light. The faint rays slipping through the cracks were enough for him to navigate. He walked straight to a workbench made of rough oak planks. Rusty wrenches, a chipped handsaw, a coil of blackened iron chain hung neatly on the wall, all silent witnesses to their owner's solitary existence. From a dusty drawer, Gus pulled out a yellowed parchment roll, its edges frayed, tied with a filthy parachute cord. He pushed a pile of rusty screws aside and flattened the paper on the desk. It was a geological survey map of Dunmore County. The bottom right corner bore a year, 1961. This map had no vibrant colors or 3D charts like modern computers. It was just black ink lines, some blurred by the sweat of a man's hands over the decades. The dashed lines mapped out a tangled labyrinth beneath Ashpine Town. It was the tunnel system of a coal mining company that had gone bankrupt a lifetime ago. Gus's calloused finger traced a main vein on the map. It crossed the highway, looped around the valley, and ran directly beneath the empty field Cinder had just clawed at. But his finger didn't stop there. It kept sliding, stabbing directly into a massive red-circled area on the map, the exact location where, on the surface, the land was currently being leveled for construction. Gus's eyes narrowed. The silence in the shed grew thick. He folded the map, turned on his heel, and walked to the darkest corner of the shed, where a thick canvas tarp draped over a hulking, uneven mass. Gus gripped the edge of the tarp and yanked. Gray dust danced in the sliver of light from the window. Beneath the tarp was a cast-iron water pump, manufactured in 1947. It was ugly, massive. It looked like a prehistoric monster frozen in time. The once olive-green metal surface was peeling, giving way to streaks of dark red rust. The side flywheel was the size of a manhole cover. The exhaust pipe was pitch black, caked with soot. Why would a man keep a piece of industrial garbage from the last century? Anyone in Ashpine would tell Gus to buy a modern high-pressure centrifugal electric pump. Light, quiet, blasting water like a waterfall. But Gus understood the dirt, and he understood the danger of modern machinery. Beneath that field was not solid bedrock. It was a 1961 mine shaft system. After more than 60 years, the pine support beams had rotted to ash. The tunnel roofs were held up by nothing but a fragile balance of weakened sedimentary rock. If a modern pump were used, the massive water pressure would slam into the earth like a torpedo. The violent stream would shatter the rock bed, collapsing the tunnel ceiling. The surface above would cave in, forming a 100-foot sinkhole, swallowing everything. Modern engineering is sometimes a blade too sharp, easily cutting the hand that wields it. The 1947 machine was different. It was old. It was sluggish. Its pressure was pitifully low. It didn't blast water down, it bled it, beat by beat, drop by drop. It would let the water seep through the clay naturally, trickling into the cracks without causing any physical shock waves. Only this archaic piece of junk had the gentleness required to touch a burning coal seam without triggering a landslide. Gus bent down, took a blackened rag, and stoically wiped the clumped grease off the gears. The coarse fabric, rasping against rusty metal, echoed dryly. He checked the gas tank, pulled the choke. Everything still moved. Machines built by the previous generation were not designed to break. They were designed to survive. "You still breathing, old friend?" Gus muttered, patting the cold iron shell. No answer, just the mute anticipation of metal. Late afternoon. The winter wind showed no mercy. The sky remained a dull, bruised gray. Gus had hauled the 1947 pump out to the field on a trailer hitched to his truck. It sat motionless on the snow like a giant iron toad. Not far away was the small hole Cinder had dug. Gus stepped out of the truck, carrying a solid steel crowbar on his shoulder 5 feet long. The tip was sharp, scarred with deep scratches. He walked to the dead center of the hole, gripped the steel shaft with both hands, and raised it high above his head. A moment of absolute stillness. The muscles on his old arms tightened, prominent beneath the canvas coat. Gus slammed the crowbar into the earth. The steel blade tore through the frozen top layer, sinking deep into the clay bed below. The shock traveled up his arms, vibrating through his bones. He yanked the bar up and brought it down again. Every strike was a heavy breath, puffing into white smoke in front of his face. The sound of metal slamming against buried rocks echoed across the vast emptiness, dry and solitary. Cinder sat huddled near the truck's tire, ears pinned back, his amber eyes tracking every swing of his master's arms. After half an hour of relentless pounding, Gus had created a probe hole 4 feet deep, just wide enough to fit a man's calf. He tossed the crowbar aside and used his bare hands to scoop out the broken dirt clods. From the bottom of the hole, the warmth rose more clearly, chasing away the frost around the rim, causing the surrounding snow to melt into a speckled ring. Time to wake the machine. Gus knew he couldn't put out a subterranean furnace with a single tank of water. That would be like spitting into a volcano. He wasn't trying to extinguish it. He was conducting a diagnostic. In the old mines, they called it reading the breath. By introducing a controlled amount of moisture into a suspected fire pocket, an experienced eye could judge the depth, the temperature, and the speed of the burn by how the earth spat it back out. Gus walked over to the 1947 pump. He opened the primer valve and adjusted the choke. He pulled out a length of thick parachute cord and wrapped it around the flywheel 3 times. His leather boots planted firmly on the snow, his hand gripping the wooden handle of the cord. He took a deep breath and pulled. A metallic screech rang out. The engine turned a few times, then died. Gus didn't get angry. Old things require patience. He wrapped the cord again. Pulled a second time, harder, more decisive. A sharp backfire escaped the exhaust, followed by a thick, blinding cloud of black smoke shooting into the sky. The machine shuddered, vibrating violently on its steel frame until it finally caught its rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. It was the heartbeat of a survivor. Gus connected a canvas hose to the pump, shoving the discharge end down into the freshly dug hole. He didn't open the valve all the way. He let the water trickle, a slow, rhythmic bleed. He stepped back, crossing his arms, counting the seconds in his head. 1 minute passed. The water disappeared into the dark gullet of the earth. 2 minutes passed. Cinder stood up, the fur on his neck standing on end. He whimpered, backing further under the truck. Then it happened. From the bottom of the dark probe hole, a violent, high-pitched screech emerged. It was the sound of nature being insulted. A pillar of stark white steam shot 6 feet into the air, vibrating with localized pressure. The vapor wasn't just white. It had a sickly, yellowish tint at the edges. Gus leaned in, his face inches from the scalding mist, sniffing the air like a predator. The steam was bone-dry and carried the heavy metallic stench of burning sulfur and carbon monoxide. The speed of the reaction told him everything. The fire wasn't 100 feet down. It was barely 40. It was shallow, oxygen-starved, and moving with the terrifying efficiency of a freight train. Gus stood still in the engulfing smoke. He didn't need a multi-million-dollar satellite survey. The earth had just spoken to him in its own language. The coal seam was on fire, a massive hidden cancer spreading in only one direction, straight toward the town. Less than 3 miles east of Gus's steaming probe hole, the landscape underwent a violent, unforgiving transformation. The desolate silence of the winter plains surrendered completely to the loud, obnoxious roar of money. A massive swath of ancient pine forest had been brutally leveled, the stumps ripped out like bad teeth. The raw, brown, slushy earth lay exposed beneath a thin, churned-up layer of dirty snow. 3 heavy-duty hydraulic excavators, painted a blinding, immaculate yellow, roared in unison. Their steel booms reached into the gray sky like giant robotic limbs asserting dominance over nature. The deafening scream of turbocharged diesel engines, the heavy grinding of iron tracks against crushed gravel, and the relentless, piercing beep-beep-beep of reversing alarms composed a deafening symphony of organized destruction. Right off the edge of the asphalt highway, a massive billboard stood unblemished, defiant against the biting wind, free of a single speck of dust. Bold gold-plated lettering popped aggressively against a rich turquoise background. Ashpine Heights, where elite living begins. A $12 million luxury eco-residential project, developed by Voss Land Development. The digital illustration on the billboard painted a picture of architectural perfection. Flawless domed roofs, sprawling emerald lawns, an absolute absurdity in the dead of the Kentucky winter, and smiling, perfect families walking golden retrievers. It was a beautiful lie constructed entirely by graphic design, funded by sheer corporate arrogance. Standing on the paved shoulder of the road, keeping a very deliberate and safe distance from the flying mud, Lena Park was working. She was a senior reporter for the Dunmore Courier, a local newspaper that specialized in covering elementary school bake sales and regurgitating hollow economic development press releases. Lena was 32, possessing sharp, angular features and the restless, calculating eyes of someone perpetually desperate to prove she was the smartest person in any given zip code. She wore an expensive beige cashmere overcoat, spotless tan suede boots that had never once touched actual dirt, and a silk scarf draped carelessly around her neck. She held a silver digital voice recorder pointed like a weapon toward the bustling construction site, her other hand scribbling furiously into a sleek, leather-bound notepad. Occasionally, Lena paused her frantic writing. She turned her head, squinting through the freezing wind, looking out toward the hazy western hills. Through the telephoto zoom lens of her expensive camera, she could just make out a tiny, insignificant dot, spewing a pathetic, struggling plume of black smoke into the gray sky. It was Gus Calloway and his ancient 1947 water pump. A thin, highly mocking smirk crept onto the reporter's glossy lips. In her mind, she was already drafting the opening paragraph for tomorrow's front-page piece. Voss's $12 million vision for the future, delayed by paranoid old farmers clinging to the past. She looked back at the giant excavators tearing into the earth with a look of sheer admiration. Modern machinery, massive capital, intricate master plans drafted by highly educated structural engineers from the big city. How could they possibly be wrong? What she didn't know, what the men driving the excavators didn't know, was that the foundational markers for those luxury villas sat precisely, not a single inch off, above the exact path of the smoldering subterranean coal vein. They were enthusiastically preparing to build a pristine, modern paradise directly on the fragile lid of a roaring incinerator. While the excavators roared outside, the atmosphere inside the temporary field office of Voss Land Development was entirely different. It was suffocatingly warm and reeked of expensive cologne. This was no ordinary construction shack. It was a modular steel container heavily retrofitted with premium faux wood paneling, plush charcoal gray carpeting, and a central heating system running at maximum capacity. The rich aroma of dark roast espresso wafted from a sleek chrome machine in the corner, masking the smell of the diesel fumes outside. Sitting behind a thick, tempered glass desk was the project manager, a proxy for the invisible power of Raymond Voss, a man who had never once lowered his Italian leather shoes into the mud of Ashpine, preferring to sign authorization checks from a skyscraper hundreds of miles away. The manager wore a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white collar unbuttoned just enough to project a casual arrogance. He removed his gold-rimmed glasses, wiping them delicately with a silk square, while his gold wedding band tapped a rhythmic, impatient clack. Clack, clack against the glass table. The door was shoved open. A violent gust of freezing wind invaded the sterile room, bringing with it the harsh odor of stale sweat, raw gasoline, and old canvas. Gus Calloway stepped inside. He was a complete anomaly in this pristine corporate bubble. His heavy cowhide boots dragged a trail of thick, black, melting snow and mud directly onto the expensive carpet. He pushed the brim of his faded cap up an inch, his flat gaze sweeping the room before settling dead center on the man in the suit. In the corner of the office, Lena Park sat cross-legged on a leather sofa, her notepad resting on her knee, pen poised, eager to witness the pathetic comedy of an uneducated local trying to halt the march of progress. "Mr. Calloway," the manager smiled. It was a manufactured, bloodless smile that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned back in his ergonomic chair. "I hope you are here to formally withdraw those ridiculous grievance petitions you filed with the town council. You see, my excavators run on money. Every minute they idle to deal with your complaints is an unacceptable waste." Gus didn't step closer to the desk. He stood like an immovable boulder in the center of the room, letting the filthy ice water drip from his boots. "The coal beneath your footprint is burning," Gus said. His voice was an emotionless rasp, short, final, like a judge reading a death sentence. The manager let out a loud theatrical laugh. He reached into his drawer and slammed a thick, glossy, spiral-bound document onto the glass desk. "Mr. Calloway, this is a comprehensive ground-penetrating radar and acoustic seismic survey, conducted by a top-tier engineering firm on the East Coast. It cost us $80,000 just to print these pages." He slapped his manicured hand against the cover. "No sinkholes, no gas pockets. The clay bedrock is perfectly compressed, capable of supporting the load-bearing weight of 60 luxury villas. Science says this land is safe." "Dirt can't read," Gus replied, his expression entirely unchanged. "The 1,961 vein is right under you, 40 feet down. It's on fire. Your heavy machinery will cause tremors. The tunnel roof is rotted out. You keep digging, the whole surface drops." The man in the suit sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose in exaggerated pity. "Old man, listen to me. The era of hand-drawn maps and sniffing dirt to predict the weather is dead. We have technology. You are desperately protecting a ghost. I heard you were out there using some rusted World War-era pump to survey the field. Stop making a fool of yourself." Gus fell silent. Not a single vein bulged on his forehead. There was no clenched fist, no table-pounding outrage typical of a powerless man backed into a corner. There was only a cold, terrifying stillness. From her spot on the sofa, Lena Park suddenly felt a shift in the air. The pen in her hand halted mid-sentence. She looked at Gus. She had fully expected this old farmer to scream, curse, and make a chaotic scene, giving her the perfect quote to frame him as a lunatic. But he didn't. The way Gus looked at the project manager was the exact way a mortician looks at a corpse. It was the gaze of a man who had dug his own friends out of collapsed mine shafts, a man intimately acquainted with the ruthless brutality of nature when it was provoked. Gus's utter silence projected a crushing, invisible weight that instantly suffocated the arrogant numbers printed in that $80,000 report. The manager shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly eager to break the quiet. He cleared his throat. "If you have nothing else to say, get out. Tomorrow morning is the official groundbreaking ceremony. Chairman Voss will be giving a live address. I do not want to see your rusty truck anywhere near my perimeter." Gus gave a single microscopic nod. He didn't waste another breath. The warning of a miner to the mountain had been delivered. If the mountain refused to listen, the mountain would fall. He turned his back and walked out slowly. As the heavy door clicked shut, Lena Park felt an involuntary chill run down her spine. Not from the winter draft, but from a sudden, creeping dread taking root in her stomach. Night consumed the town of Ashpine. The flesh-cutting cold slithered through every pine needle and rocky crevice. Gus Calloway sat on the wooden steps of his front porch. The sickly yellow light from an incandescent bulb cast his long, hunched shadow onto the snow. In his hands was an oil-soaked rag. He was methodically wiping down and greasing the heavy iron gears of the 1,947 pump. The repetitive mechanical motion was a silent, meditative ritual. At his feet, Cinder lay curled into a tight ball, his amber eyes wide open, staring intently into the pitch-black void of the plains. The perspective drifted away from Gus's porch, gliding high into the freezing night sky, sweeping over the jagged silhouettes of the trees, moving rapidly toward the empty field. It stopped exactly at the probe hole Gus had violently carved out hours ago. In the darkness, a grotesque physical anomaly had formed. Around the hole, the snow had been completely eradicated. The thermal radiation from the subterranean depths had intensified exponentially. Not only had the ice melted, but the surrounding clay had been baked into a dry, ashen-gray crust. A perfect, flawless 6-foot circle of scorched earth now scarred the frozen landscape, violently exhaling thick plumes of steam that carried a concentrated, suffocating odor of sulfur into the night wind. Directly beneath that scorched circle, 60 feet below the crust, a sound echoed. It wasn't loud. It was incredibly deep. A hollow, groaning frequency felt more in the chest than heard by the ears. It was the sound of structural failure. The sedimentary rock, after hours of being superheated by an oxygen-starved coal fire, was beginning to splinter. The ancient rotted pine support pillars finally snapped into dust under the crushing gravitational pressure. The view panned slowly to the opposite hill. There, bathed in the blinding artificial glow of stadium floodlights, the massive yellow excavators of Voss Land Development sat parked in perfect, triumphant rows, like a steel army awaiting dawn. A perimeter of bright red ceremonial ribbon had already been strung up, waiting for the applause, the expensive champagne, and the fake smiles of tomorrow's loud, groundbreaking event. Hundreds of tons of heavy steel resting silently on a fracturing eggshell. Back on the porch, Gus stopped wiping the gears. He shoved the oily rag into his pocket, reached under his canvas coat, and pulled out a battered pack of cigarettes. He drew one out, flicked his lighter. The brief flare illuminated the deep, shadowed trenches of his face for a fraction of a second. He inhaled deeply, blowing a long stream of smoke into the frozen, starless sky, his flat eyes locked onto the distant, glowing floodlights of the construction site. Gus reached down, rubbing Cinder's coarse head. His voice was a faint whisper, blending seamlessly into the biting winter wind, dry and completely devoid of pity. Tomorrow is going to be a loud day. The screen instantly cuts to pitch black. The deafening, subterranean sound of rock shattering vibrates violently through the audio track, followed by absolute, dead silence. Arrogance always pays the ultimate price in a collapse. Tomorrow morning at Ashbine Heights, there will be no champagne and no smiles. Only the earth opening its jaw to swallow the greed of men in tailored suits. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tune in tomorrow for episode 2 to witness exactly what happens when nature finally loses its temper. Thank you for watching.